Welcome back to the second video in this session with me, Dr. Jamie Green, on social media and its use in primary care. The next part of this session is going to be talking about the history of communication and the history of social media. The history of social media, and much of the language used in it, relates to methods of communication that came about before the computer. I'll start back at the earliest postal service, dating back to 1550 BC. Much later, in the 1700s and early 1800s, the first telegraph machines were developed, allowing faster and more widespread communication. A vast improvement on the horses. Telephone and radio were the next developments, starting in the 1890s, further increasing the distance and usefulness of communications with a greater expansion of telephone lines and radio transmitters. In the 20th century, there were huge developments. The telex messaging system came online in 1933, allowing communication via the inexpensive voice telephone lines rather than the dedicated telegraph lines. A little later, in 1937, there was a proof of concept using binary logic as the Model K adder was invented. This showed us that maybe binary could be used as the future for computing. In the 1940s, computers very quickly developed, not least in part due to the war. There needed to be a quick way to decode the Nazi ciphers, and these included supercomputers, but these were electromechanical. In 1946, the first fully electronic computer system, ENIAC, was revealed to the public, and it was 1,000 times faster than the electromechanical counterparts. Eventually, by 1949, the invention of the modem came along. This allowed the modulation, that's the turning of digital data into sound, and then the demodulating, that is turning the sound back into digital form. This allowed the American military computer systems to talk to each other using ordinary phone lines. Once again, this was cheaper than dedicated data lines or telegraph lines. In the 1950s, computers found themselves into universities, government organisations, and most of these systems required punch cards for programming. It wasn't until 1956 that early work was done on direct input devices, including the first keyboard designed by a chap called Doug Ross at MIT. The first large-scale computer communications network, which was called the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, or SAGE, was built by IBM in 1958. It comprised of 23 computer sites in the USA and Canada, and pioneered computer networking. It was designed to detect Soviet nuclear bombers as they entered US airspace. In the same year, digital phone lines between the telephone switching centres allowed more calls to be put through. In the 1960s, larger computers were designed to timeshare, allowing dozens of people online at the same time. They were not strictly networks of computers, but they pioneered the first ever examples of electronic mail or email, file sharing and chat. By 1964, inspired by the SAGE program, IBM and American Airlines produced Sabre on two large IBM 1790 machines. It linked to 2,000 terminals in 65 cities and became the first widespread booking system for flights. In 1968, in the mother of all demos, Bill English demonstrated the NLS system, which introduced many new features, including collaborative editing, video conferencing, word processing, and the mouse. It also used hyperlinks to link the elements of the system. In 1969, computer networking came to the masses, with the APRANET leading the way for the large-scale general-purpose computer networking. By the end of the year, the British National Physics Library network was up and running. In 1971, the same year Intel launched the first microprocessor and the first memory chip, the now famous @ symbol was born. It was once just used as an accounting and invoicing tool, meaning at the rate of. And it was chosen for networked email protocol on the APRANET system. By 1973, 50% of network traffic was email. It was clear that closed networks were not going to be enough, and early work on making networks of networks, or internetworking, now abbreviated Internet. This was technically difficult and required new networking standards to be created. The first of these internetworks was the link between France's Cyclades network and Britain's NPL network. Over the mid-1970s, commercial networks multiplied in many businesses. In 1976, Queen Elizabeth II sent her first email at the Royal Signals and Radar establishment in an elaborate demonstration of networking technology. During the late 70s, personal computers were popularised with names like the Apple I in 1976 and the Apple II in 1977. You may also have heard of the Commodore, which came out in 1977, and the Atari, which came out in 1979. Most of these were not connected to a remote server, due to difficulties in connecting and expensive modems. Those that did started to subscribe to some online services like Micronet, later which would become the CompuServe information service, and the Source. In the early 80s, the rise of the IBM PC and the Apple Macintosh, and between 1989 and 1990, the World Wide Web Protocol was demonstrated by English programmer Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN. He had an internet server, HTML, URLs, and developed the first web browser. In 1991, restrictions allowing the commercial use of the internet came into place, and by 1993, commercial websites were using adverts as a source of income. In 1995, with Microsoft starting to embrace the web, they made the Microsoft Network a web portal. This was also the year they released Windows 95 with built-in Internet Explorer, which made internet increasingly accessible to its customers. With 36 million users by the end of 2006, the web had a long way to go before the 3.5 billion internet users there are today. In 1999, the first Wi-Fi technology made its way to the shops. In 2000, despite the worries about the Y2K bug, the dot-com bubble was well and truly on its way. One of the biggest of these, and probably one of the most significant, was in 2004 when Google was publicly floated. 2004 probably also marks the time when the real concepts of social media were defined. This was first coined Web 2.0, whereas 1990s website would deliver content to surfers. Web 2.0 gave users a voice. Examples included the Wiki, which comes from the Hawaiian word of quick. This was designed as a concept in 1994, and Wikipedia, the world's most popular wiki, is an encyclopedia and was opened in 2001. Social media like MySpace and LinkedIn gained prominence in the early 2000s. PhotoBucket and Flickr facilitated online photo sharing, and YouTube was opened in 2005, dominating video sharing. Blogs, from the term weblog, allowed users to tell their story, but early on tended to be single user entities before later embracing multiple user entries. Facebook was also launched in 2004, initially around university campuses, and became widely available to the general population in 2006 from anybody above 13 years old. Twitter was launched in March 2006 with a short messaging service and pioneered microblogging. You may well be watching this on an iPhone, and the iPhone was launched in 2007 and revolutionised the phone market. You may have also shared documents on Dropbox, which was released in 2007, popularising the idea of keeping data on a cloud. By 2010, 3G mobile internet allowed apps to become the most popular way to access the internet. And by the end of 2010, you could buy your first iPad. In our next video, we'll look at what social media tools and websites are available now, and we'll look at how you might apply these into medicine.